everyone. Hi and welcome to the third of our Medway Innovation Institute Big Conversation speaker series. I know we've got a mix of Medway NHS Foundation Trust staff and other NHS colleagues from up and down the country. We're delighted to bring you some really exciting content today from our colleagues from Carnall Farrar. I'll introduce them in a second, but thank you so much, all of you, first and foremost, for joining. When we run these speaker series, we don't have any agenda other than to have an interesting conversation and to generate some good discussion and debate that can help us in our planning and our innovation work at Medway. So we're up for a really good conversation today, and that brings me on to who we've got lined up for you. So. Without further ado, welcome to Ben Richardson and Scott Bentley from Carnall Farrar. Hi Ben, hi Scott. Ben is a co-founder and managing partner at Carnall Farrar, where he leads their work in life sciences and data science and analytics. Prior to joining CF, Ben was a partner at McKinsey, and he has worked across all aspects of health and care systems and for life sciences companies in the UK and around the globe. Welcome Ben. Scott Bentley, also from Carnall Farrar, senior manager there working in life sciences. He's worked extensively in the health and care systems of the UK and life sciences companies. And prior to joining CF, Scott worked at ZS Associates. Welcome, Scott. Hello, hello. I should say as well that I used to work with both Ben and Scott, so this is a little bit weird for me, but delighted to have you both on. I was really struck by just the level of fantastic kind of insights generation and foresight work that was coming out of Carnall Farrar during COVID-19. At a time when lots of the scary statistics were pointing to ventilator capacity and elective backlogs, it was lovely to read some of the research about some of the positive aspects that you're going to take us through, as well as some of the negative aspects that we need to steel ourselves for in relation to the innovation agenda and the links to the wider economy. So thank you so much for doing that research. It's all available, I understand, from your website. So if people are particularly stimulated by what you talk through today, there's lots more reading material they can find on your website. But with that, I will hand over to Ben and Scott momentarily. We, in terms of housekeeping for how we're running today's live event, we're going to have a bit of a 15-20 minute presentation from Scott and Ben. And then what I'd like from you guys really is to be posting any questions that you have in the Q&A as we go. And then after the presentation's finished, we're going to have a good discussion and go where the energy takes us. But please do use the Q&A function in this webinar to post any comments or questions, and we'll come to them after the presentation's finished in about 15-20 minutes. So with that, I'll hand over to Scott and Ben, I think initially, who's going to take us through the presentation.
That's great. Thanks, Jack, and it's a pleasure to be with you virtually. So we're just going to give a quick run through with some slides, as we're sort of want to do, and then hope that triggers questions and discussion. We can pick up the latter part of the discussion. So the topic we are addressing is innovation and the health of the economy in a post-COVID world. So I'll just cover what we're going to say up front if Scott advances the slides for us. So the main points we want to make is that, first of all, start with what is innovation. We see it as the development and spread of new methods and approaches in medicine, devices, and digital, and that is something that has contributed powerfully to improving outcomes. Cancer and cardiovascular are both excellent examples of how outcomes have been improved through innovation, but also how barriers continue to exist in those areas. We've worked with our colleagues at the Institute for Public Policy Research on a number of these topics, and together with them we've pointed out the major economic prize that exists in innovation, which includes economic participation and avoided cost, seen from the patients that benefit from that, and what is the value of that to the economy as a whole, as well as more directly the value of R&D and manufacturing in life sciences, which is really critical to a post-Brexit economy for the UK. Now, that was the stage set of what innovation looked like before COVID, and now we've had this immense discontinuity in COVID, which has had a major impact on innovation, some of it positive and obviously some of it quite negative. There is now a need to reinforce innovation and an imperative to build back better is the phrase that we've been using in recovering from COVID, to support innovation and support the recovery. And there's a unique role for trusts in the context of ICSs to play in how to do that. Not so much in how do we go and discover entire new things, but really how can we take bits that have been proven to work and find ways to make them more systematic. So those are the key points we're going to run through, but we're going to quickly illustrate it with a handful of slides. So the first thing is just to cover the definition of innovation, saying we've used the report there to set the definition of innovation as a new way of doing something that improves quality, not simply performance. And we've looked at it as applying to care models, applying to digital, and also applying to medicines and therapy. So many different areas. And there's sort of a pathway of innovation that goes from research and invention and trial through to then the application of it in the licensing, adoption, and spread. And our main thesis is that the problem is more on the bottom there. How do we adopt and spread things that we know work, as opposed to how do we invent more new things? Next slide. Just to cover the tremendous impact that's been seen. This is a quite simple chart just showing mortality rate on the left for men and on the right for women. And it's striking because it's only a decade that's shown here, and you can see the huge drop in mortality from heart disease and significant drop from the big four cancers over just a decade. You can also see the purple line rising up, that's dementia. And if you look for the light purple, the dark purple is dementia, and the light purple or mauve one is Alzheimer's. Partly that's a reflection that because of that lower level of mortality and what used to be the big killers means people are living longer and therefore being more afflicted by those. But tremendous impact visible without doing any manipulation to it at all from the UK statistics. Next slide. And if we get under the hood of that a bit, we've seen over a longer time frame from the 1970s to 2010, huge improvement in cancer survival rates, which varied tumor by tumor. And so they partly depended on the specific innovations put in place. So, breast cancer, you can see nearly doubled in survival rate from about 40-ish to about 80-ish%, due largely to the increase of breast screening, but also new targeted therapies like Herceptin. Similarly, bowel cancer has had a huge improvement, an even greater percentage improvement, with improved surgical techniques and the application of screening programs and endoscopy. So each one of those has got a slightly different story, but amazing progress that we've seen there. Similarly, in cardiovascular, if we take a look at stroke, which I know has been sort of topical for the area of Kent and Medway recently, there was an enormous improvement in a process of the application of scans within a narrow window of time on the back of research showing that there was a golden window that if you had treatment within 3 hours, you could have dramatically better odds. And so what that meant was that you had a huge improvement on the left there, showing the proportion of patients who were scanned within 24 hours. And you can see that sort of the really shocking levels that there were before, back in 1998 to nearly 100% being scanned. That was by 2016. But despite that fact and that amazing progress, you can see on the right the huge variation in patients who receive thrombolysis, from about 5% up to more than 20%. And thrombolysis is obviously only deliverable when you've got the right set of conditions in place, with a dedicated team and a dedicated CAT scan and the ability to administer that. So it's a good illustration of just how much variation remains for no particularly good reason. And that's why we're pointing to the question is about adoption and spread. Now, what's it worth? Well, this is a slightly busy chart, but we've looked at mortality on the left, and we've looked at disability adjusted life years on the right, and it shows that the UK lags in both of those compared to peers, particularly in Alzheimer's, stroke, and cancer. So you can see those listed. The UK is the pink bar, and you can see that the Anglo-Saxon average and the best international peer is shown in blue and green. And you can see that there's room for improvement in reducing mortality. The lower number here is better, and in reducing disability life-adjusted years, which points to, at highest level, looking at condition by condition. Again, this was research we did with the IPPR. There is a substantial opportunity for further improvement, despite the progress that's already been made. Next slide. We've also seen that this is something that needs to be prioritized and invested in by the country as a whole, because the economic prize for the country is staggering. It's worth about 28 billion each and every year, if we were to capture that. And by capture it, we say, well, if we were to match what best practice is, we would see more people who are economically active for longer. That's a benefit to the Treasury of £8.3 billion a year, and avoided health and care costs of even more, 10.3 billion, as well as if we were to achieve higher levels of R&D and manufacturing in pharmaceuticals. So collectively, those elements together would benefit the health and wealth of the country to the tune of 28 billion, which is a little bit less than a quarter of the size of the NHS as a whole. So it's difficult to lose sight of just how important that figure can be for the UK as a whole. Just to make the point that what's actually happened is that we have stagnated and lost ground in the share that we have and the absolute volume of R&D expenditure and pharmaceutical manufacturing. So the pink line in both of these, on the left R&D, on the right manufacturing, shows if we'd simply maintained our share, what would have that looked like? And the blue line here is what's actually happened. And this is, I should say, before taking into account China and India, etc. This is simply, advanced Western countries that we are losing out on, and losing out in particular to the United States. So it's not that it's like upstart Asian countries. So trying to illustrate here the massive opportunity in innovation. And now I'm going to turn over to Scott to talk about, the last point. So one of the things, this is, I think, really important for trusts to, that we spend this huge amount of money on R&D, and this is the R&D expenditure from government funds, £2 billion a year there, and in comparison we spend 50 million. So 2 billion on the one hand and 50 million to support the adoption and spread of innovation. And that's one of the things I think that trusts are at the front line of really addressing. Now, that's the world as it was, and obviously something major has happened called COVID, and Scott's going to talk about that.
Great, thanks, Ben. So obviously there have been both positive and negative impacts of COVID on innovation. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but just kind of a few examples. So when we think of our greater uptake of innovation, it's obviously been very rapid setup of clinical trials, particularly for vaccines for COVID and potential treatments. A couple of other interesting examples in some other therapeutic areas. So the treatment of HIV. Throughout the COVID period, there was new guidelines in terms of recommendation of newer, more innovative treatments, which reduced the amount of interactions that were required and allowed people to not need to come into hospital as regularly as they would otherwise have to. Similarly with cancer medications, there was new guidance from NICE in terms of the treatments for certain types of cancer, including some earlier treatment with immunotherapy than there was before. And obviously one that has been very clear is the shift to virtual healthcare appointments within the NHS. On the flip side of that, there have been examples of stifled innovation. So outside of COVID, there has been a slowing of R&D in terms of other therapy areas and clinical trials, and it's important that they get back up and running again. I think there's certainly been a greater reliance on some tried and tested methods, as one would expect. And then obviously some of the big funders of therapy area specific research, such as BHF, CRUK, have obviously had to cut their spend due to a cutting funding. There's obviously been some significant contributions from the life science industry in terms of innovation throughout COVID. So within testing, including the 1 hour test, the antibody tests, and I think Roche in particular have been the forefront of some of that. Obviously within treatments, so we've got both new drugs, for example, remdesivir, but then also dexamethasone as well, and the use of that from the Oxford trial. And then lastly, vaccine, which is obviously one of the hottest topics, and certainly within the UK, AstraZeneca and their partnership with Oxford has particularly got a lot of press and hopefully will bear fruit soon. Just want to talk a little bit about one of the points that was brought up on one of my previous slides in terms of the shift to virtual. So this was some analysis we did a couple of months back now, so looking throughout April in particular in terms of primary care appointments. Obviously, as I'm sure was similar around the country, there was a significant drop, about a third, in terms of primary care contacts when looking back to 2019. What was interesting and again not surprising was the shift from 17% of virtual before up to 66% during April, which again I imagine has continued throughout May and June. But then when you looked in particular at those consultations of kind of the phone versus digital, it was primarily phone consultations. So there's still potentially some movement there in terms of moving from phone to more true digital interaction using video, so on and so forth. This was just out of interest. This was one particular ICS we looked at, so I'm sure there's some variability around the country. Just talking a little bit about impact on different segments. So I'm not going to talk through this whole slide, but if anyone's interested to read it further, it is on our website. But I'll just pick out one area, which is cancer, where I think obviously has been in the news recently and throughout COVID as one of the areas that has been hit significantly. And if we look along the kind of patient pathway, so from a prevalence point of view, we're likely to see a shift in terms of the stage in which people are diagnosed at, particularly in some of the more aggressive cancers, so for example lung, as people who haven't presented across over the last few months. We saw some significant reductions in 2-week waits and diagnosis in general. I think this slide was written very much at the peak, so probably looking at April, and on the next slide it has smoothed out, although there's still a way to go. And obviously screening as well was pretty much stopped. From a treatment point of view, we saw big drop off in all forms of treatment, particularly chemotherapy, particularly surgery. I think radiotherapy was less hit, although there was more of a shift towards using radiotherapy instead of some of these other treatment mechanisms. And obviously, in terms of people that have gone through this, generally less access to longer term care and post-surgery rehab. And this is kind of summarised on this slide, which looks across, I think, April, May and June in terms of what's been the average drop in 2-week waits, obviously drop in emergency presentations, diagnostics across the board, in particular endoscopy, which has still got a little way to bounce back, whereas the others are starting to come up more to speed. And then chemo, radio and surgery, as I said, have all seen drops, but particularly in surgery and chemo. One other point just to pick out here was that about a third of cancer clinical trials were disrupted throughout this period as well. I'll hand back to Ben just to take us home. Oh, Ben, you're on mute.
Very smooth. Last couple of points to think about. So we had an imperative before that there was a huge opportunity in innovation. We've had this huge discontinuity in COVID. And so now what we're talking about is an imperative to build back better and think about the different lenses through which you can think about that. One is with patients. There's a key need to help patients to understand the risk of COVID relative to the risk of disease. For people at risk of cancer, the risk of cancer killing them is far greater than COVID killing them. But we also need to help them to understand and provide patients with a secure environment and support for the adoption of digital tools that can help to identify and segment and target and bring in the right patients. In diagnosis, I'm sure that you're well aware of this, that there's an urgent need for diagnostic volumes to increase, but that's hampered by the utilization rate available because of the infection prevention control. And so, that combination of the need for COVID secure plus capacity increases suggest that the role of diagnostic hubs away from the middle of the hospital site. In treatment, there's again an implication that testing and tracing has been one of sort of a bête noire of the COVID response. If we want people to feel secure, then we need to have far, far greater levels of testing. And the notion that at the moment we'd test someone well in advance of a procedure, have them come in and get tested again, and the staff who are interacting with them aren't being tested frequently, points to a major problem that is reinforcing the first point, that patients are afraid to come forward because they're fearful of healthcare settings. We also need the ability, as has happened recently with guidance from NHS England, to fast track therapies that support immune systems, and to think about what does contactless care look like so that we can minimize interactions that create risk. And then how can we similarly in recovery use digital for routine follow-up and enable rehab in the patient's own homes. So those are a few ideas that we've had. We know from the talk about the next slide from research that we've done. This was actually with our Darcy and Imperial, looking at what are the key challenges in the adoption of digital. That the main issues are not really technical ones, but cultural ones. Questions about leadership, culture, funding, capabilities, and regulation and commissioning are the most common cited ones. So it's not the availability of specific technologies that is the issue. And so with those sort of imperatives and challenges, what does it mean for the role of trusts? And we here, I mean, there's many ways you could tackle it, but just thought about what could be done clinically in each service. What does it mean to build back better? What does it mean to have contactless care in that service line? Also, what does it mean are the services and patients that are the highest priority? Digital, I think the obvious thing is start with the point above and say, how can we make use of integrated data? And you're in an area where you have the benefit of this integrated data. How can you use that to identify specific individuals that need to be prioritized for care? How can we make use of a more rapid shift, not just to virtual consultation, but digital? So get the 98% that's still old world technology, higher up, and the 2% that's truly digital increase. How can we create the faster flow of data so that we can understand our current position? Again, given the data environment that you have, it may be possible that could be a leader in this area, which would have national significance. The workforce, again, I won't need to tell you that there'll be critical shortages in key areas on the one hand, but also the need to build capabilities to support these themes. Financial question for, how can we make use of the suspension of normal finances to support the shifts that deliver better outcomes? And then in life sciences, how can we consider partnering with life sciences companies be used to advance your local priorities for your local population? So not go and do something that isn't what your top priorities are, but whatever your top priorities are, there will be life sciences companies that would be interested in finding ways to partner to support the rapid uptake of adoption. So those are a few thoughts for you about where it sits in the trust, but you'll know much more about your own situation. Maybe it's possible we can have some discussion and dialogue about that. So that's the end of our quick rattle through slides.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Scott. There are some really interesting questions that we probably need about an hour to unpack coming up in the Q&A, but I'll kick us off, and I do encourage others, particularly colleagues from our research team, who I know are on the line, to post any further thoughts that they're having as we kind of wrap up with a bit of a discussion. It really struck me what you said about the sort of polarity that existed in the messaging. So, we were saying to people, and colleagues will remember how it felt in the thick of wave one, stay away from hospital at all costs. We didn't know what this virus was, and yet, as you present the kind of impact on that in terms of screening rates and particularly cancer detection now shifting right. It is monumental, and actually I think I read somewhere the other day that the deaths attributable to sort of the later identification of cancers will probably exceed the number of deaths attributable to COVID-19. This is a real problem that we're going to have to contend with, particularly as we look ahead to potential wave 2 and we plan for winter. How, Ben, Scott, how do we do that as a trust? I mean, you mentioned digital as an answer, but this is something that's quite soon upon us. what would your advice be based on the experiences that you've amassed working up and down the country with hospitals like ours? What are the 2 or 3 things that we absolutely have to prioritise in terms of getting that message out to patients around screening and early detection in a kind of COVID-19 era?
So just to mention, if I'm not sure if you saw it or not, but our research with the IPPR was picked up by the Sunday Times last week, and our number was it wouldn't exceed cancer deaths, COVID deaths, but be a significant portion thereof. You know, maybe 8,000 deaths compared to 40. But there are other estimates that it might be higher. I think that so what we understand from speaking to quite a few dozen different clinicians, different organizations, is that the issue is not in secondary care in terms of the bottleneck, right? So once patients are getting, and I'm sure you're probably seeing this in your own trust, but once patients get through, they can have chemotherapy, they can have radiotherapy. There are a few more issues with surgery because what I alluded to, bus trips back and forth, and so there are some issues with that, but in general, the capacity exists to do that. The critical bottlenecks are in the diagnostics, especially in endoscopy, and in the actual presentation, the referral to the acute and the presentation to primary care. And our hypothesis, and we don't have firm enough, we have very firm data that can demonstrate there was a huge drop in the 2-week wait referrals. And that was the basis that we used for our analysis. We can't say for sure why that's happened. But what we know is that comparative work showed that the UK population was disproportionately inclined to not present and share symptoms because they were worried about bothering their GP.
Yeah.
That is an older research that we can see that. And so our hypothesis is that the message, which was unique around the world, of stay home, protect the NHS, no one else put protect the health service. So I think that messaging and the fear of COVID, the desire to protect the NHS, fear of COVID, has caused people to not come forward when they had worrying signs, saw a spot, etc. And that cancer can hit people at all ages, but it increases with prevalence with age, and so those that are more likely to be at risk of cancer might perceive a risk of COVID, and that's the other reason that they're not coming forward. So that is back to, so what should we do about that? Well, I think to the extent that patients are worried about the hospital being a safe place, having COVID secure is critical. To the extent that GPs are worried about there being sufficient capacity to see patients, having the diagnostics are critical. So those are two small things, COVID secure and diagnostic capacity. And then the third, if you really want something easy, is you've got to help patients perceive that the risk of cancer is worse than the risk of COVID if they have symptoms.
Yeah, I don't know if Harvey McEnroe's on the line, but it's comforting to hear you say that those 2 or 3 things are the critical things, because we are addressing those things, but not insignificant tasks. I'll come on to a couple of questions that have appeared in the Q&A, if that's okay, Scott, Ben. One from one of our fantastic Neds, who will have been really excited by what you were saying about how we use integrated data sets and how we sort of step up to the digital challenge. Jenny's question is, what are the regulatory hurdles to getting innovative products to market? And are there particular types of innovation that are easier or harder to get approved for the commercial market, e.g. medical devices or drugs? While you sort of think about that, your response to that question, it really struck me during COVID just how many of the sort of governance processes and the regulatory processes in the hospital got a bit more lenient during COVID-19 to allow for rapid adoption, rapid spread. And we saw that, didn't we, across the country when, you know, Formula One were stepping into the fray to help us develop CPAP devices and things. Notwithstanding, obviously, the regulatory hurdles that I'm sure they had to get across. What's your thoughts on the regulatory environment and in relation to innovation, Ben? Scott?
Might let Scott pick that up.
Yeah, I will. I'll have a go at that. I guess there's a couple of going back to the beginning of the presentation when we were talking about how we think about innovation and the different types of innovations, and I think they each have different hurdles themselves. So if we think about care models as maybe a starter for 10, obviously the innovation there is some of the hurdles there are obviously first kind of knowing they exist, and then secondly very much being able to go through that transformation process, which may require changes in the way workforce is deployed or the volume of workforce that's required, so on and so forth. I think that's often one of the biggest hurdles that we see, I'm sure you're familiar with, in terms of care model innovation. When we move more onto the kind of the medicine side, I mean, there's obviously the kind of the standard general time to get something to market, which is going through trials, so on and so forth, which is all very important. There are, I think, potential ways that they can be improved in terms of the time they take, so optimizing recruitment, so on and so forth. But that's somewhat of a fixed period of time. Where I think we see some of the biggest issues in terms of innovation uptake in medicines, though, is price and willingness to pay in general, which is understandable to an extent. There are significant deals that are made on a regular basis in terms of capping the spend on medicines. So that is to stop things getting too out of control. But I still think there is often certainly a reticence in terms of what people are willing to pay for some of the real innovations that are coming around the corner. Ben, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I guess if you think about it in those areas, care models, medicines, and digital, the burden that needs to be surpassed is highest for medicine. There's a very clear set of processes for the authorization of a medicine, and its licensing, and then cost effectiveness assessments, and finally commercial arrangements. So that's quite well trodden. The areas that trust will be most interested, life sciences companies be most interested in working will be in late stage research, where something is been demonstrated to be effective, but they're trying to establish the evidence that shows it's cost effective and then can be adopted quickly. So that's one specific area. That's in medicine. In digital, the barriers are, I mean, there is a requirement if something is a new algorithm for that to go through a specific set of processes. But the biggest issues are really about just securing the adoption and use by providers, and I think you'd find a fairly willing market of digital innovators that are willing to work together on something if there's some promise at the end of it about how that helps them. And then in care models, I mean, they're pretty minimal restrictions, especially compared to medicine and digital, of what's needed. And so in some ways, the areas that the trusts would find most easiest to innovate in is how can we change the pathway to support contactless care at lower levels of risk. And that would be areas that people would be very interested, I think, if combined with digital and medicine, to find potential partners who would like to work in those areas.
Yeah, Ben, I think that's all really valid points. And I mean, one of editor McCallum, who's our brilliant head of research and innovation here, one of her points touches on your slide as well around the discrepancy between the research spend and then the spend on scaling through the AHSNs. Pathway plus digital innovation is something I think we really do well in peacetime. We have really struggled with, I think we do as an NHS have to kind of try and influence that a little bit to remind people just how much time, effort, money is needed on not just kind of making the evidence base for an innovation, but actually getting it out there, testing it, iterating it on the ground, and making the case for its use as a default and not as a sort of shiny innovative thing. It's actually the new way we're going to do these things. There's a couple of other questions I want to touch upon that might take us to a slightly different place, but I don't know, Ben, Scott, if you can see any of the other the questions that are popping up. It might be worth picking up any that are particularly interesting to you guys. Sunil James, our patient safety officer and a consultant orthopaedic surgeon, he and I have been having some really interesting conversations about the elective backlogs and the waiting lists. And Sunil asks the question, the proportion of, is there any research showing the proportion of necessary versus unnecessary, or avoidable versus unavoidable, I'm not sure which terminology is right, consultations in the NHS? Is there evidence that reduced during COVID? And how do we manage that going forward? What are your views?
Maybe I'll just start. So we did a lot of work sort of in the the beginning of COVID and during the peak in trying to understand demand and capacity and what was going on. And I think there was obviously hits across the board in terms of levels of activity, but in particular, we were looking at did some work in primary care, and we looked at the drop-offs there, and as I said in one of my slides, it's about a third down. And when we were looking at that, what we were particularly trying to understand is exactly that point in terms of that 30%, how many of those were our kind of very much our frequent attenders, our worried well, the sort of ones didn't necessarily need an appointment but would often go, and how much of that would we see in terms of a bounce back versus just almost activity that didn't happen and won't need to happen in the future. And obviously at that point our modelling was very much assumption based, but I think what we started to see, and I haven't seen the very, very latest data, was that there wasn't really a significant bounce back in primary care. And obviously it's starting to return back to some fairly normal levels. I don't know if it's quite back yet, but not this sort of potential big bounce back we're seeing, which then kind of leads itself to the sort of initial hypothesis that actually a lot of the appointments that didn't happen were on the kind of unnecessary side.
I think what I'd add to that is obviously it's something you'll be thinking through service by service, which segments of patients are the most critical and how to prioritize those and get them back in. I think on the other side of the sort of the driver of the initial consultation, if that's primary care, on the other side, we've seen in general a trend of much more rapidly rising outpatient activity, and levels of follow-up activity, which in many cases are, I think people think are not indicated, and may just be because of habit. And I think this notion of contactless care and digital has great opportunity there, because it's it may be the case that there's sort of follow-up measurements or tests being done, and how can we think about those being undertaken at home, filed digitally, and reviewed and reviewed only by exception by the clinician. So I think the short answer is we don't know, to Sunil's question, but we've got good reason to hypothesize that some of that is unneeded, some of it is critically needed, and the consequences of cancer, and some of it could be better addressed digitally or through contactless care.
Yeah, it's a really well made point, Ben. And it's funny, we often talk about follow-ups a lot, and it's often the follow-ups that get that kind of really critical eye over them around necessary versus unnecessary. But actually, a lot of the work we've done in Medway around how can we transform outpatient appointments has revealed that a lot of the particularly post surgical procedure follow-up activity is so essential for a patient feeling sort of monitored and looked after, even though from a healthcare system that's already very stretched perspective, it may not seem like the most critical use of that very skilled consultant's time, perhaps. But actually, if we can pursue a world that's digital first, and we can service by service consider contactless care, there's a way we can get around that and do right by patients first and foremost. Editor raises a nice point in the chat. Patients are encouraged to be involved in development of research, but not so much in the development of innovations. It might help the uptake. I think that's a really nice point, Editor. And actually something we're very keen to do through the work we do in the Medway Innovation Institute, involve patients in co-design and co-production of whatever we're innovating on. Well, listen, it's been a really interesting topic to dig into. And one that I know for many colleagues, it's not the sort of thing that we regularly come up for air and talk about. So thank you both so much for such a great presentation and for giving up some of your time for this. I'm sure colleagues on the line will want to carry on some of the conversation. So please do so, guys. We will post something up on the Medway Innovation Institute website. We'll post this video for people that didn't manage to make this slot. But I hope you enjoyed this as a bit of a lunch break. Thank you once again to Ben and to Scott from Carnall Farrar for taking us through some of their research. And with that, we'll leave it there. But thank you very much, everyone, and stay well.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye. Great to see you, Jack.